Hello Pandalorians, and welcome to the best of Season 2. In this episode, we discuss what truly makes a good horror game. This one was a lot of fun to record, and maybe not as fun to research. Nevertheless, we hope you enjoy. Welcome to Satsunami. Hello everybody, and welcome to another episode of Satsunami. I'm Satsunami, and joining me once again for another spooky episode is the man, the myth, the sinner sandwich himself, Adam. Welcome to the Spookfest.
Hello, hello. Happy Spookenings one and all. Good to be back on an extra spooky episode.
Do you know, I was actually just thinking about this the other day, how the last time we did a spooky episode, or rather one that focused on horror, other than Birdemic, that doesn't count, no matter how strongly you feel about it, Adam. It does not count as horror. Well, a romantic horror, is it not?
We'll argue about this later, but you know my feelings.
Yeah, the last time we talked about horror properly was episode 3 of Satsunami, so if you haven't checked that out, essentially it was just an episode about our views on horror games, which unfortunately we were unable to release it in October because we actually started the podcast in November. So we have missed a full month of spookiness with the podcast, haven't we?
We've got to make up for lost time now.
Exactly, we've got to get all the spookums in, we've got to get all the horror films in, we've got to get Shaun of the Dead on repeat in the background. You know what? I'm not arguing with that one, I have to say.
I already got it on.
Well, of course, yeah. You're a super fan of it, which...
It's on a 24-hour loop in my house.
So in that episode, we discussed pretty much our favourite horror games, didn't we?
Yeah.
And we
Can you remember mine? Here's a question for you. What were my 3 favourite horror games?
Was Half-Life 2 one of them?
No, I brought that up as like my favourite horror experience in a non-horror game, but that was a good pull. Well remembered.
Yeah. I'm just trying to remember. It definitely wasn't Outlast. I know you had Resident Evil. Was that one of them?
No, it wasn't surprisingly. I am a fan, but I didn't pick that one.
You know what? Do tell. What were your favourite horror games?
God, some fan you are of the product. Listen to the product, man.
That's the first rule of podcasting, okay? You don't listen to your own product.
Don't get high on your own supply. Very true.
Exactly.
Very true. Words to live by, kids. Anyway, so my three favourite were Observer, Bioshock, and Alien Isolation.
Oh, of course. 3 classics, to be fair.
Indeed.
Yeah. So, out of curiosity, jumping on that point, what is your experience with horror games as a whole?
It's a genre that I came to in... I feel I use this phrase every time on these podcasts now, but in later life. You know, your late 20s now count as later life. But yeah, so I never really played them when I was younger, and nor really in my teens. It wasn't really until my kind of like early to mid 20s that I started playing things like Slender and stuff in groups, because it was kind of fun to, you know, like watch people get spooked and have a laugh at. And yeah, kind of from there I then started playing more than by myself, like got into the Resident Evils, played some Silent Hills, things like Observer and Alien Isolation, things like that. And yeah, so I had a real phase, and it was a phase, Mom, actually. In my, like, as I say, like in probably about my late 20s for a couple of years, where I really was into playing horror games. I've kind of gone away from them a bit now. I still play the odd one every now and then, but yeah, I'm not as into that genre as I once was.
I have to admit, I'm kind of on the opposite of the spectrum. I'm definitely more of a, no pun intended for your favourite game, but I'm more of a observer than I am like an active participant, because I'm getting better now at playing them, but when I was younger I used to be one of those people that would watch people on like YouTube play them, and you know, you would always get people who would have like the huge reactions. They would go, oh my goodness, you know, it's, I don't know, like, oh, it's a person from Outlast. That famous character, person from Outlast. Get him in Smash, come on, let's get that trending. But you would get these reaction videos where all of these like famous YouTubers would play these games, and I would watch thinking, oh, this game isn't, you know, so scary and everything. And this is kind of a moment that I do bring up quite a lot in the channel, so I do apologise in advance, Adam. But one of the things that I do bring up a lot is one night where you and I played a lot of horror games together, and I feel as if that is kind of one of the turning points where I started to warm up a little bit more to horror games. And out of curiosity, do you remember the games we played that night?
Oh, well, I remember we played the first Five Nights at Freddy's. We tried Amnesia, couldn't really get into it.
Yeah.
Did we play some Slender? Did we play some Slender the Arrival, like the one that's on like consoles?
I think we did. I can't remember if it's the same night, but we definitely played it.
I think we maybe went on to that after Amnesia bored us to death.
Yeah.
I don't think it was this night, but I remember you playing some of that Emily Wants to Play, but I don't think it was the same night from what I recall. I think that was a different night.
Are you sure? Because I'm sure you and I had a mutual friend over as well who left just because I'm sure he left just at the exact moment that we started to play Emily Wants to Play.
No coincidence, I ask.
I think not. Oh, yeah.
Am I missing it?
No, I think that was it, really. 4 very distinct games under the same umbrella of horror. Some better than others. And that's the thing, though. Like, horror is much like comedy. It's very subjective. And it does appeal to certain types of people. You know, like, not everyone will be into, you know, like, games where, you know, for example, Dead by Daylight, not everyone's going to be into the slasher horror kind of game. Not everyone's going to be into the hide and seek aspects with Outlast. Not everyone's going to be into like atmospheric horror, like Little Nightmares or things like that. You know, there's a whole spectrum other than just, you know, the tagline, it's a spookum. Because I think that's the danger with a lot of these games, that people just try to go into them for the spooks.
Yeah.
There's a lot of games like that where they have so much more to offer than just like, you know, oh, it's just the spookums. But because they've kind of, like, have you ever come across a game like that where the hype kind of overrides the game itself? So like when a popular YouTuber plays it, like let's say Five Nights at Freddy's, for example, you know, where every YouTuber and their mother started playing that game. Is there any other game like that you feel as if kind of got overrun with hype?
Well, I think Slender was Slender was maybe one of the first ones.
Oh yeah.
Like, really caught on, you know, and got people's attention and was like what like Five Nights at Freddy's kind of followed that trend. I mean, I think Five Nights at Freddy's is the example I would use. Because it would have been interesting to have seen what my reaction to it would have been if I'd never like if I'd just heard about it and never like seen anybody play it. Yeah. You know, because by the time we played it, I was very well versed in exactly like what this game was and how it worked, and you know, like what and everything, and I even knew like some strategies for it and everything. So it would have been interesting to have like seen what my reaction would have been, have not seen all that, you know, the kind of buzz that was around it. So I think that's the one that I would say the hype really overran, in the fact that it was kind of impossible. Like you really had to try if you wanted to go into that game blind not to see anything, because it was so omnipresent everywhere.
Yeah, it was like plastered everywhere on the internet, on YouTube's homepage. Before we jump into the main, you know, discussion of this episode, this is kind of the danger of horror games, and I don't know if you agree or not, but do you ever feel as if all it takes is one trendsetter to influence like the other games? A bit like how FPSs go with, you know, like if you have Call of Duty and then a lot of other games after it, because Call of Duty is so popular, then they start to copy it. And the same with Fortnite, you know, that a lot of games have a battle royale mode because of it. Like, do you feel as if the same applies to horror games?
Definitely. I mean, like, the horror gaming genre is one that I think is, like, I'm not saying game design is easy, like, at all, but I feel like it's easier to make a horror game than it is to make, like, a first-person shooter or, like, a platformer or something. So, you know, and I say fairly, again, just to overly simplify, but it's probably fairly easy if you know what you're doing to, like, make a knockoff Five Nights at Freddy's or a knockoff Slender. You know, they're quite simple games in a way. So I definitely think while all gaming genres are definitely like hostage to popular trends, I think in the case of like the horror genre for games, I think it's just the ease that people can just churn out so many like knockoffs of whatever games, you know, the fad of the month.
Well, without any further ado, as we're kind of talking about these particular games, should we jump into the main topic of today? That, of course, being what makes a good horror game.
Let's do it. I'm wearing my brown trousers just in anticipation.
And while I look out my own brown trousers, we are going to listen to some spooky messages, so we will be right back in a couple of minutes. Welcome to Satsunami, a variety podcast that talks about topics from gaming and films to streaming and general interests.
Previously on Satsunami, we discussed Game of the Decade, Deadly Premonition, the romantic thriller, Birdemic, and listen to us get all sappy as we discuss our top 5 Christmas films.
If that sounds like your cup of tea, then you can find us on Anchor, Spotify, YouTube, and all good podcast apps. As always, stay safe,
Stay awesome, and most importantly,
stay hydrated.
We are Beer and Chill Podcast.
Podcast where we review TV shows, games, movies, and whatever else takes our fancy.
So what are you waiting for? If you're a cool kid like us, you're gonna listen to the Beer and Chill Podcast. You can get it anywhere from Spotify all the way to your grandmother's radio. My name is Jan.
And I'm Craigie C.
And we are
Beer and Chill.
Oof, I don't know about you, but those were some spooky messages.
I am thoroughly spooked, I must say.
Spooked to my core. And my brown trousers. But that's beside the point. So yeah, let's jump in. So today we are talking about what makes a good horror game. So I'm going to throw over the question to you because I'm just like that. I'm sorry, Adam.
The spookenings are beginning. Oh no.
Yeah. So what, in your opinion, what would you say makes a good horror game?
I think that there's a lot of things that contribute to making a good horror game. If I was going to pick some of the most important ones, I would start by saying that there's a real importance in nailing the sound and atmosphere of your horror game, because that really, those two things really kind of lay the foundations for everything else that's kind of gets layered on top of it. Yes, I think those things are especially important because the sound and the atmosphere are the elements that really kind of can draw you in and really kind of hook you and put you on edge, you know, and that's ideally what you want. You want to be tense, you want to be put on edge when you're playing that. And yeah, so when I think of like the horror games that I've really enjoyed, like the sound and the atmosphere have been like key parts of that. Like I think of something like Little Nightmares, just the really like creepy atmosphere of that ship, and you know the way the kind of like the light and the dark and just the like the environments themselves, taking away like all the kind of the enemies and the monsters there, just like the really creepy like environment and the atmosphere of that ship really just like set me up completely to be spooked and to be drawn in. And the sound as well, like, you know, the ambient sound, but also the kind of creepy music. There's like a bit at the end of Little Nightmares as you're approaching like the final boss battle. You might remember this, but there's like a character starts to like kind of hum. I don't know if you know, as you're like exploring like the kind of upper levels of the ship, and you just hear this really ominous humming, and it's just this like really simple tune, but I remember like the shivers going down my spine and everything hearing that. And my favorite horror game of all time, and I'm gonna probably bang on this game a lot in this episode, so apologies in advance, but a game called Observer, which takes place in this kind of like, majoritarily takes place in this kind of crumbling apartment block, and it's kind of like Blade Runner inspired kind of like sci-fi setting, and you know you're investigating these murders throughout this apartment block, and there's creepy things going on, and there's kind of like almost like monsters like roaming around the building and chasing you and everything, and just the atmosphere of that game was just dripping in atmosphere, you can imagine, and just the way it looked and everything, and just exploring this apartment block, I was just so full of dread and just anticipation for what was going to happen. And again, there was like the ambient sounds and everything just put me on edge. So I think if you can nail both of those key things, your sound and your atmosphere, then you're off to a good start.
No, I totally agree with you. I think that if you ever been on YouTube and you've seen those videos that, like, for example, in their original context, they're like quite cheery videos and, you know, upbeat and things, and as soon as you add like a sinister soundtrack to it, like I think the example that comes to mind is the Mary Poppins trailer. Have you seen that, the horror edit?
Oh, I've not seen it, but I've heard of it.
Yeah, it's, for those of you who don't know, it's basically just the Mary Poppins trailer, but someone's put like a very sinister sound, like just, it's basically just an edit of the original Mary Poppins trailer with a very spooky soundtrack attached to it, and it turns this film from being this very, you know, light-hearted and, you know, spiffing adventure into this like grim, dark horror thing. And I do think that sound design definitely, it plays a key part in these kind of games, and especially with building atmosphere. Because can you imagine how underwhelming it would be if Little Nightmares didn't have those sounds and soundtrack?
Oh yeah, like I mean, you would lose like that game would lose all of its like when I say charm, obviously charm usually means something happy and good, but like in the context of horror, it would if you took away those parts of Little Nightmares, it would lose all of its charm and identity, and probably be a pretty like mediocre experience, honestly.
I'm just thinking instead of the grim humming and things, it's just like the producer's, I don't know, child with his SoundCloud account. It's like, hey, you want to hear my mixtape? It's like, not in this game, but thank you.
I don't want to hear the theme to Paw Patrol, please.
I know, but it's a remix. It's like, oh god, no, that's a horror in itself. But going from that point you just made, I'm gonna like take it back a bit and say that horror games for me, like to be a good horror game, they have to nail the basics. Like this is gonna sound like a weird one. It sounds like very general, but trust me, I've got a point. Yeah, for me, horror games definitely have to have like a fundamental understanding of what they want to achieve, if that makes sense. You could create a horror game filled with jump scares and, blood and gore and quote-unquote realistic graphics and all of this, but if you've not got a point to it, it reminds me of, there was a video I saw ages ago with, I think it was Markiplier. Have you ever seen his stuff?
Yeah.
Yeah, that small indie YouTuber called Markiplier.
I've heard of his channel.
Yes, yes, in passing. And as you know, he does a lot of horror Let's Plays, which are really interesting because you get to see like all sorts of horror games coming through. And some of them are obviously better than others. Some of them are just like weird indie, like short games, and some of them literally emphasis on the short. And I remember one particular video, and it's always sat with me, and I don't know why, but it was this game where I think it was called The Tunnel or something very generic, where it was literally one guy walking through a dark tunnel, and every couple of minutes he would get like a scary image popping up, and it would be a very loud screaming sound, and all you hear would be the and he got to the end, and I have never seen anybody so bored looking in my life. Like, he genuinely, by the end of it, he was just like, okay, that's fine. But that's the point, like, I'm making. It's one thing to take, like, all these stock images, stock sounds, mash them all together and be like, yeah, this is what we want to do. But if you don't have a point to the game, then it's just a jumble, really, of noise and graphics, isn't it?
Yeah, as you say, like, if you don't have, like, a central hook, then it's just basically filler, isn't it, at the end of the day? And, as you say, like, it's that way of, like, I think real horror comes from there being, like, a kind of core. There's like a reason for that character to be there, like whatever if they're trying to escape or they're trying to find something or somebody, but if you don't have any of that stuff, if it's just like random person walks through tunnel, blah, something jumps up at them, then yeah, exactly. Well, it's just a waste of everybody's time, isn't it?
Yeah, because I mean, look at games like, I'm just trying to think, like, I mean, Five Nights at Freddy's, let's go back to that. That is just a simple game of a security guard who is looking after a pizzeria that has, like, it has something more going on under the surface and everything, and that in itself is a very basic premise, but at the same time it does elicit some spooks, because there's that anticipation that the animatronics are going to get you, you're constantly on the watch and things, it's keeping you busy, and that kind of basis is like definitely a good starting point. And I do think that other games like let's say Outlast, for example, that sets up the game right away. You're a investigative reporter who has been tipped off that there are spookums going on in this haunted asylum, or I should really stop saying that because it isn't haunted yet, but you know what I mean. It's a creepy
asylum.
Yes, nothing wrong here, officer. That's the hook. And then you explore and the atmosphere builds and things. And it's a great experience all round. Well, for the most part, but we will get to that later on. But yeah, I feel as if those kind of games definitely knew what they were all about. And I mean, going back to one of your personal favourites, Bioshock, I mean, that immediately drops you in, no pun intended. And yeah, it establishes the world, it establishes what your purpose is there, and basically how to survive.
Couldn't have said it better myself. I think the other like key element that I would say, so I think there's really three kind of pillars to this question from my perspective, which is you got sound, you got atmosphere, and I think the last one is pacing. I think horror games work at their best when sort of the developers and the game designers keep a very tight leash on the player's actions. You know, some other games, it's better if you can like kind of let the player explore and kind of, you know, to use that great phrase, play the game their way, you know, play the game your way. But I think for a horror game, like you really want the design to keep their hand on like the, you know, the tiller and like really control how the game's unfolding. And you really like all games need good pacing, but like with a horror game, you really have to find that sweet spot of giving the player like, you know, high moments of high stress and tension and horror, whatever you're going for. But you also need those points where there's just nothing happening. It's just a chance to, it's either a chance to like allow the player to breathe and feel a bit of safety, or even like, you know, let their imaginations run wild, you know, let them run riot. Because as human beings, we often build up situations in our head, like much more than they're ever going to be. You know, if anybody's ever been to a job interview, for example, I'm sure you built it up in your head to be like the most stressful, like the worst thing ever. You know, so often our imaginations are the best at like running riot and like stressing ourselves out. But that pacing thing, and it's funny because I was thinking about this game that I played a few years back called The Sinking City, which is a kind of Lovecraft-inspired game in the kind of Cthulhu mythos. And so it was like a kind of survival horror game, but it was set in an open world, taking place across this like city that was like basically sinking, as the title implied, and full of these kind of eldritch horrors. And like, so basically you would kind of explore the city and you'd often have to go into like buildings and stuff, and there you'd get attacked by all these kind of like Lovecraftian monsters. The problem with it was that because it was an open world game, so you walk into a house and say you get attacked by these monsters, if it's just too much, then you just walk out the house and go somewhere else in the city. And you're like, you know, it really, really undercut any kind of like horror that they were building. While if I think of something like, again, I'm going to bring it up, if I think of something like Observer, that was such a tightly crafted experience that like it was very linear, and there's not much like scope for the player to really explore that much. You can a little bit, but you can't really go too far. So like you're always kind of getting forced like down these paths and everything, and like the designers have built it around so you have moments of like slow, nothing really happening. The atmosphere is kind of, you know, infecting you and everything, and then there's moments of high stress where you're having to run away, you're having to hide, whatever. And it did a fantastic job of like balancing those two ingredients. So I think that is a really crucial one. Honestly, as well, I think horror games are at their best when they're relatively short. Observer was only maybe about 4 hours. Like, I honestly think something like a 4 to 6 hour experience is probably the best for a horror game, because like that way, if it overstays its welcome, something like Alien Isolation which was just too long for me. So it turned from being like a terrifying experience to actually quite like a frustrating one. So yeah, I think pacing is a really crucial element if you want to make a good horror game.
Short and sweet, essentially.
Yeah, unlike my answer there, short and sweet is what you want to go for.
I've actually got a question for you. Going off that point, what are your opinions on player agency in relation to all of that? Because I'm just thinking of games like, as we said before, like Little Nightmares, Outlast, Amnesia to a certain extent, but you know, those kind of games where you don't have really much to fight back with. You know, like Slender as well, that's another one. I mean, even Five Nights at Freddy's, the list could go on. Emily wants to play, you know, like there's a lot of games you get where, you know, you're completely defenseless, you have nothing to defend yourself, and some games even go as far to say, listen, just don't fight them, please. For the love of God, we coded this game for a reason, don't fight them. Whereas there's some other games like Resident Evil and Bioshock and maybe Observer. I mean, do you get like a lot of defences on that?
No, Observer's very much in the Outlast mold.
Is it? Oh, okay. But yeah, like, what do you think? Like, how does that fit in?
It's a really good question. I think both approaches can work as horror experiences. I think there is something incredibly terrifying about not being able to defend yourself and just having to flee and hide. That there is like a special kind of terror in that. So I think that's really effective. And just from the fact, well, I think as well from how popular that kind of subset of horror games are, how many there are of that, just kind kind of goes to show. But I think as well, even if you give the player things to defend themselves with, you can still craft a really, really like terrifying experience. And a lot of that comes as well from like giving the player ways to defend themselves, but making sure there's a lack of resources. So that's a big thing in kind of a lot of the early Resident Evils and some of the early Silent Hills. Like there are weapons, but melee weapons break. There's not a lot of ammo. It's difficult to find. Enemies can be a bit spongy. So often it's that kind of like you're having to make like strategic choices about like, is it worth taking the zombie out, or am I better just trying to like duck and dodge around them, and just like get on my way and everything. And that adds a lot of tension as well. And so I think you can do it. And like another one of my like a level that I've brought up quite a few on quite a few different episodes. It's not from a horror game, but it is a horror level. The Ravenholm level in Half-Life 2. Half-Life 2 is a first-person shooter, and so you've got a pretty good arsenal by the time Ravenholm is about just towards the end of the first half of the game. So you have a fairly decent arsenal when you enter this like spooky like deserted town filled with all these like zombies and monsters and everything. But it's a truly I found it absolutely terrifying. It didn't matter like how many like the fact that I had machine guns and shotguns and grenades and everything. I was like absolutely like I was sweating it and everything. I couldn't wait to get out. And so it's totally possible to make a horror game out from either approach. But it is that I think there is something special if you want to give like a player like some agency to defend themselves and everything. Making it like that lack of resources to force to get adds an extra level. So you can't not only like engage with the terror of the situation, but you're like, oh God, I have to try and stay kind of rational to make decisions, which adds another layer to it. So I think both approaches have the merits.
And kind of just going to like what you were saying there about Half-Life 2 being like a first person shooter first and foremost, and then all of a sudden turning into this horror experience. I think the other example I'm thinking of is Gears of War. Did you ever play the original one?
Yeah,
First one? Because while the other ones did turn into the huge, over the top Michael Bay like action fest, the first one, although it was kind of similar, because let's face it, it's big muscle men with like huge chainsaw guns, and it's like the typical games that were kind of coming out for the Xbox at the time. But there's like one particular level in that where you meet the Berserker, and like for those of you who don't know, the Berserker's like this huge like creature that's blind but it can hear you, and it's like this huge hulking mass and charges you. I remember the first time I saw that and I was terrified, because I was like, throughout the whole thing it was like, oh yeah, I'm just shooting aliens. Well, that's a whole other point, but I'm shooting these creatures and yay, I'm having fun and everything, even though it was quite dark and gothic to begin with. And then all of a sudden, the way they build it up, they just show you the creature's shadow, and they show you like the guy getting torn, like off screen, but they show him, or they let you hear the aftermath of like just a regular guy bumping into this creature, getting torn apart, the screams and everything, and you think, oh my God, what is going to happen to me? And then later on in the series, they kind of like diminish that impact to when it just becomes like another boss with a bigger health bar. But at that time in that game, it is done so effectively, and it almost comes out of nowhere. Like it is, as I said, it's a dark game, but I didn't expect that. Like, I mean, when you first played it, did you expect that kind of level?
No, not at all. And there's actually a lot. It's been a while since I played the first Gears of War, but there's actually quite a few. I think back to like the Krill as well, who are this kind of like swarm of bat type enemy, which is almost like something like Dracula-esque, in a way that you need to run from light source to light source, because you have no way to actually defend yourself against them. Like light is your only real defense, and like that's very horror inspired, and it was a kind of shocking departure. As a game that, as you say, you've been built up to be this like hulking like space marine basically, who can like chainsaw his way through swarms of aliens. And yeah, so to have that kind of sense of powerlessness, like all your shiny guns and your big chainsaws can't do anything, to defend you against them is a really like, it's that way of the rug pulled from under you, isn't it?
And I mean, it's kind of an example of horror games getting a bit more creative, isn't it?
Oh yeah, and it's that way. It shows like in a way kind of the ubiquity of horror in a way that you don't have to, like, horror games aren't just horrors, or is not just for horror games per se. You can it is like a genre that can be like supplanted into another type of game, even if it is just for a brief stint. And it just shows as well well, like that, you don't have to, it's not just a stereotype if you have to be some weedy person who has to hide in lockers, to make a horror game. You can to have a horror experience. You can make a horror game from like, people who are like armed to the teeth with like veritable arsenals of weapons. You can still make an effective horror experience.
I mean, just look at games like Dead Space, where you do technically have an arsenal, but at the end of the day, you're eventually going to run out of bullets, or you're going to run out of resources, and once that happens, you're screwed. I mean, it's the same for games like, technically, would you say that games like Bloodborne and Dark Souls, would you say they're horror games?
I don't know if I'd say they're horror games. Like, they're definitely like elements of horror to them, especially Bloodborne. I bet Dark Souls as well, in fairness, but again, like, you could argue they're horror games, but I don't know, like, I would maybe say horror adjacent.
Yeah.
That like they are, in fairness, they're probably of their own, like, we now say Souls-esque games, don't we now? Is it?
Yeah.
Soul. Is that what we say now? For that genre's become, but definitely horror adjacent at the very least. They are informed by different aspects of horror, whether it's like your more traditional like werewolves and things like that in Bloodborne, or more kind of like mythical like creatures, in Dark Souls.
What about games though that take the horror over the top? So I'm thinking of games like, similar to what you were saying there about games that have hints of horror, like for example Doom, where it's like it's overrun with all of these, they're not aliens or demons, aren't they?
Yeah, demons.
Yeah, like, would you include a game like that into the horror category?
That's a really good example that you brought, because I was actually thinking about this earlier. Like, from an aesthetic point of view, Doom is if you just look at Doom, you're like, that's a horror game. As you say, demons from hell. They look like scary. Like, if there were any other game, you'd be like, they'd be terrifying monsters and everything, and it looks like that. But I wouldn't say Doom's a horror game at all. And it comes down to that. It comes down to this idea of empowering the player. Doom is the ultimate like power fantasy in so many ways, and that you're loaded up with all these like ridiculous weapons. It's not a scary franchise. I mean, Doom 3 is the kind of outlier in this one, but like most of the main Doom games, like, they're not scary at all, because you've got so many. You've got like chainsaws and like super shotguns and BFGs and everything like that. There's no reason to be scared, because you can like rip and tear through the legions of hell at your will, basically, because you're almost like a literal god in that sense. But by disempowering a character, you can make an experience so much more terrifying. So something like Silent Hill 2, which is often held up as like one of like the great masterpieces of the horror gaming genre, you're just playing as a guy called James Sunderland, who's just basically your average regular dude. There's weapons in the game, but James isn't like combat trained or anything, so when he's swinging a pipe or a 2x4, like it's that way, like you'd imagine somebody who's unaccustomed to doing it, just like wildly swinging. He's not very accurate with weapons, not particularly good with them as somebody like that would be. And like the enemies in Silent Hill 2 in many ways don't maybe look as terrifying as the demons from Doom, but it's just that sense of you feel much more helpless as James Sunderland than you ever do as Doom guy, Doom Marine, whatever you want to call him. So just by that way of disempowering a character, you can just up the horror so much.
Would you say like that the further you do empower a character, like the more items you give to defend themselves, the less it moves away from, the more it moves away from the horror genre and more into something else, like action, shooter, that kind of thing?
Completely. Like, there's I just finished playing up Resident Evil Village like last month, and for the most part, like that is a horror game. It's not a particularly scary one, because again, like I feel like they give your character a lot more weapons and a lot more chance to upgrade weapons and get ammo and stuff. But still, like, there are points in that game where you're having to, like, you are running low on things and you're desperately searching, and it can get quite tense. But there's a point in the game where you take on the role of another character who's like a special forces soldier who's like armed with like grenades and flashbang grenades and like tons of like machine gun ammo. And the game, it just turns into almost something like COD Modern Warfare at that point. And it's not scary. You're just mowing through all these enemies that were like, could be quite tense and scary to an extent, like, in the kind of when you're playing most of the game, but they're just rendered like cannon fodder, because you're like, you're geared up basically, and everything. So completely, like, I think the minute you empower the player to like defend themselves, or like even to the extent where it's not even like you're defending yourself, you're actually on the offensive, you're taking the fight to like the demons or monsters or whatever it is, that just, the scares go out the window at that point, because why would you be scared? The enemy should be scared of you. It's the complete reverse of it.
Would you say, though, that kind of going to the opposite side of that, I mean, it shows you the spectrum of games that we're looking at here on, in the horror genre, because look at Resident Evil Village here, where, again, although it's considered to be a horror game, as you said, you get all these weapons to defend yourself, you're able to, at least put up a fight compared to something like Outlast. Like, if you swap them around, do you think Outlast would be scary if you had a gun or a lead pipe or something to defend yourself? It would probably be less intimidating than being able to defend yourself, but still it's classed as a horror game. But kind of going on that point, do you think there's maybe like a case where there's too much of that, where the player doesn't get enough defense and it almost feels as if like it's a bit unfair, or it just doesn't work the same?
I definitely think so. I mean, I think maybe one thing to say about like a lot of these games that do like completely disempower the player and like there's no way to defend yourself at all, they kind of can feel a bit repetitive in a way.
Yeah.
Like, it does kind of feel like once you've played a couple, you can kind of tell, you're like, okay, like I know the deal with this. It can be frustrating as well, because especially sometimes you look around the environment of some of these games, you're like, why aren't they just picking up this? Why aren't they picking up this chair just to like swing around? Like, so again, and that's a way, like that kind of breaks your immersion. 'Cause I think like all games are better when you're more immersed in them, but especially I think a horror game, if you can really put yourself in there, like that's going to make it such a more scary experience. But when you look around, you're like, why isn't the character picking this up? Like, why don't they do anything to go defend them? Why can't you push? Like, why can't you like block or something? Like, I think it can be a very frustrating thing, as you're like, it just seems unrealistic, and you're like, okay, fine, maybe the character's terrified, but there does come that adrenaline thing, isn't it? It's not always flight. There's also some fight in there as well. So yeah, I totally think like it can be a bit like aggravating to an extent when you're like, oh god, like I have to go and hide again. And it depends as well, I think, on the difficulty of something. With like a game that I really liked the first half of, and I thought maybe it's one of the best horror experiences ever, Alien Isolation. The first half of the game is so tense, and like anytime the alien shows up, I was freaking out, and like and that game gives you what you can't kill the alien, but you can defend yourself. Like there's like a flamethrower you can have, which if you get it off in time will like make the alien flee, so you've got a chance to like recover and get away, and go back to what you're doing. And that was a really, really tense experience. But like there's a point later in the game where you have to go through and slight spoilers ahead here, so skip ahead 20-30 seconds if you don't want to know. Like there's a point where you have to go through like an alien hive, and it's such a confined space, and there's a couple of aliens, and basically there's no way to hide from them. They're going to find you at points, so you have to just basically save enough flamethrower ammo to like get through it. And it was such an aggravating experience, as I was like, oh my god, like, right, go into this little bit, get my flamethrower out, blast away, make a bit more progress, rinse and repeat. And it was just, I wasn't scared in the slightest. I was just annoyed. So I think that's a real danger of that kind of like hide and seek approach to horror.
And I think repetition does like kill what could be a good horror game.
Yeah.
Like, I'm just trying to think of other games that we played. Like, as we said before, and I know I keep bringing up Five Nights at Freddy's, but it seems to kind of like encapsulate everything that's right and wrong with horror games in a way. Like, on the one hand, it's short, it's sweet, it's simple, you can blast through it in a couple of hours. The downside to it is it's very repetitive, and once you've been jump scared a couple of times, because when you and I were playing it, we were sitting there, like, by the end of the night, we were just like, oh, we got spooked again. Oh no, it's not something that is engaging anymore. Like, as soon as you get that one cheap shock, same with Slender, whether it was the 8 pages or, the new one, was that just Slender the Arrival? Yeah. Because there was a particular scene in that I remember where you're in I think it's a warehouse or a factory, and one of Slender Man's proxies come after you, and what you're supposed to do is you're supposed to shine a torch in his face to like ward him off. And although that sometimes does work, there are like other times where, you miss him or something, and it just gets annoying that every time he keeps, appearing in front of you, or you just die, and that's it. Like, there's no recovery period, there's no nothing, you're just dead. It's like there's no comeback from it. You just have to keep repeating over and over again the same thing. I mean, I think that was probably our issue with Amnesia, and I'm going to touch the elephant in the room here, so apologies if you hear it in the background. But yeah, I personally was not a big fan. We only played it for a couple of hours, to be fair, but I personally wasn't a big fan of it. But I'm going to let you explain so I can get my car keys and run away as the mob come to your door and not mine.
Smart move. I think the problem with Amnesia is, and I'll be kind to the game and say that I think when me and you were having that night of playing horror games, we kind of wanted games that like got the horror in early.
Yeah.
You know, like got the scares in. Amnesia's not that kind of game. It is a game that kind of builds itself up, and I don't think maybe we were in the right mood for
Yeah.
it, you know. That kind of more drawn out experience, but like it just felt, from what I recall anyway, it just felt like nothing was really happening, and it was one of these things where it was like a key hunt, a glorified key hunt. We had to find things, and it was like, what are we even looking for? It wasn't really clear what we were looking for and where to find it, and it just got frustrating.
I would second that. It was one of those games that, like, where do I even begin with this? Like, it's a slow burner, emphasis on the slow, where, you know, it's got the atmosphere and everything, and I do agree. I think if we were in the right headspace to tackle it together, then maybe we would have had a better time. But that's the thing, and going back to like a previous point I made at the beginning, I think Amnesia is one of those games that was killed by the hype. Small indie YouTubers like PewDiePie and Markiplier, and all of those, they played these games religiously when they came out, you know, making scare compilations, they were screaming into the camera and things, and that, I mean, for me personally, that gave me the impression that this was like a spookum game, you know, that you were going to get the spooks like right away, but yeah, the spooks never came. I was waiting at the window wondering when my spooks would come, but they never did. It was a shame though, because maybe I'm not giving it enough credit. But something else I would say, and I think maybe this is more on the player rather than like the developers themselves, but I think personally to get like the best experience of a horror game, you have to do it in short bursts.
Agree.
Like, unless it's like a game that's really short, they can do it in one sitting. So to kind of give context, last year in 2020, I streamed Outlast, Little Nightmares, and Condemned Criminal Origins. 3 like brilliant games in their own respective rights. But with Outlast and Little Nightmares, I was able to complete them in about 4 hours, give or take, in one sitting. For Condemned Criminal Origins, I tried doing the same, and yeah, it did not go well. I ended up sitting there for 6 hours trying to complete it, and now I'm just like sick of the game. Like, and that's the thing, it's like Condemned has like a lot of really creepy moments, like when you're in the shopping centre and all the mannequins come to life, you know, when you're down in the basements of places. Things like that are really creepy but really interesting, but playing it for 6 hours straight was not the way to experience it. Like, would you agree with that?
Oh, completely. Like, I mean, because I played Condemned as well, and I did it in much more shorter bursts, and I enjoyed it far more than you did, and so I can totally see what you're saying, and I think that's the thing with something like Five Nights at Freddy's as well. I think that game would work best in about a 20-minute sitting. You know, 20 minutes, you get really scared, you get really freaked out, and then you switch it off and do something else, and then come back to it. And as you said before, like we like stayed with it, and it was just like, okay, another jump scare, another death, do it again. Oh, another jump scare, another death, you know, and it just lost all its kind of charm. So I completely agree. Short bursts are the way to play these games for the most part.
And going back to like a previous point you mentioned, honestly, I feel like an interviewer just now, or like an investigator being like, going back to what you said when you said you were there on December 5th.
Columboing me right now.
Exactly. Oh God, I wish I had the jacket for Columbo. One day I'll have the voice and the coat. But anyway, sorry, my childhood dreams aside, I'm just thinking back to what you were saying before, because you said about a good horror game should have like characters, or rather the players, on a short leash, and they should be kind of directing them, you know, in a certain way. What about games like Until Dawn, Man of Medan, you know, those kind of like story games?
Scripted kind of.
Yeah, basically the horror games that David Cage wishes he could make.
Kind of choice-driven ones.
Yeah.
I think they can work as well, because I really enjoyed Until Dawn. I still think they are very highly scripted in that way that like you are going to end up in kind of a lot of the same situations.
Mhm.
But granted, you are right in that you do have more agency in like, you know, who lives and who dies. You know, not that you always know exactly that that's going to be the outcome from your decision. So yeah, no, I think a choice-driven experience can really work as well, and like that adds a level of tension to affairs. You know, as you say, because you are like, oh god, like by making this character go down this corridor, have I like killed them? You know, or what's going to happen here? So that definitely is a very effective way to do horror. Like again, I still think it's in that way of like being, it's still quite a tight leash. It's not as tight like Observer or Outlast or something like that, but like still, again, it is quite like, you know, you are being very much guided through it. Like it's not like an open world where you can go and explore and stuff. But definitely, it's a good point to bring up a choice-driven experience, because that extra level of like your decisions matter. You know, really can just adds a whole extra layer of horror to the proceedings.
So I was just thinking about games like the way you were talking about open worlds games, or, you know, like kind of sandboxy horror experiences. Unlike, you know, GTA, you have the Blair Witch Project, which came out a couple of years ago, and that, of course, is, you know, that's the point of the Blair Witch Project. There's like a huge forest where the characters themselves get lost. But in terms of the game, it goes back to your point of, you know, you get really frustrated with it because there's like just so much going on, and you need like certain items to like continue. That's the thing. It's again going on to this idea of repetition. You're doing the same thing over and over again until you eventually progress. But by that point, you know, you're sick of the game. So when something does like pop out, you're like, oh, okay, you do know I've been in this wood for like 10 years now, and they're like, yeah, we know, you know. And that's the thing though, it goes back to your thing of like repetition ruining a game, and yeah, I feel as if that kind of dulls the experience, which it is a shame because it can kill off some really memorable experiences.
Oh, completely. Like, you know, as I said, like I will always hold up Alien Isolation as the example of that, and what I thought was an absolutely fantastic like concept, and a game that was like, for the first half was executed flawlessly, just was basically almost ruined in the end because it just outstayed its welcome, and it was just frustrating. And it's really a shame.
Did you ever feel like that in other games, though? I'm just trying to think of games that, again, like the developers give the player a little bit more freedom to fight back, like Dead Space, for example, or like Condemned. Like, did you ever feel bored with that to the same extent? I mean,
not to the same extent as Alien Isolation, because I didn't find those games as frustrating. I certainly find with some of the Resident Evil games, especially some of the later ones, especially Seven and Village, they do start to get quite combat heavy towards the end, and that can become quite repetitive. I know it's frustrating per se, but like it can become like very much like you're trudging like one room to the next, and then like, oh, another like swarm of monsters to like kill here and stuff. And it just seems to be a thing that those games kind of resort to after a while, and it becomes, you're just like, oh, it's a shame, because it kind of loses the charm that the game had, as it becomes just like a kind of like a bog standard shooter. And then you start to notice that the shooting controls aren't that good, like, you know, which is actually something that can be quite good early in the game because it adds the tension. But when you're like fighting swarms, then you're like, oh my god, like, you know, how many shots are missing? So yeah, like not to the same extent as Alien Isolation, but like it is a common thing in horror games, is they almost want to like transition into a different genre, and you're like, no, just stay what you're doing. It's actually good. Don't be like a mediocre, don't be like a below average version of something else.
No, that completely makes sense, because I'm just thinking of when Resident Evil took that shift, and I think it was probably around Resident Evil 5, maybe?
Yeah, much more combat.
Yeah, especially, you know, the boulder punching, which I would have like put a spoiler warning, but I get the feeling that everybody knows that scene, whether they're Resident Evil fans or not. But yeah.
Like, unless you've been living under a rock, but the chances are that rock was uppercutted.
Yes.
The way people know.
I mean, you're not wrong, yeah. That rock is in the atmosphere by now, the amount of times it's been punched. But yeah, that's the way it seems to have gone. And even games like, I mean, granted, I haven't played many Silent Hill games because I am terrified of them. I do think, like, I have seen other people play them, and it does, like, build up a huge atmosphere. But one of the games that I did notice people panning was Silent Hill Hill Homecoming, which seems to take a completely different approach. Like, it's still got the horror elements, and it's got Pyramid Head, which, yeah, you know, there's a whole, like, fight about that, about why Pyramid Head after Silent Hill 2 makes no sense, but you know what, we gotta get those Funkos in. That's all I'm saying. Anyway, yeah, like, that seemed to be a bit more combat heavy. Like, it still had its, like, don't get me wrong, it's not like Resident Evil by any means. Like, I'm not saying, it's turned into Resident Evil, but it does seem like a lot of horror games either are going in one direction or the other. They're going in this sense of, do you want the player to have nothing, or do you want them to have something? You know, it's the blue pill, red pill kind of thing. It's like, do you want them to have something to defend themselves with, or do you just want just like a running simulator?
Horror games can often fall into the trap of, well, it's not really a trap, but one of the big fundamental problems with like the horror gaming genre is they don't always make the most money.
Yeah.
You know, it's not always the most popular, and it's not always the ones that, like, as I say, like, get the highest sales compared to things like shooters or, you know, your quote unquote action adventure games. So almost a lot of horror, especially the mainstream kind of horror titles, try to almost kind of lean into that genre. And that's the Resident Evil games became that for a while. 5 really started like flirting with action adventure, and 6 was like, you know, by the time of 6 they were fully married together. And as much as like 6 is the worst Resident Evil main series Resident Evil game, I think it's still the one that's probably sold the most and sold the best.
Oh,
because
really?
it's an action adventure game that is more attractive to people, you know, to a bulk of people than like a survival horror experience. So I feel like they get caught in that way of publishers and developers are like, well, we want this game to sell. It's that way of what's popular. Action adventure's popular. People like those kind of games, like your Uncharted and things like that. Let's lean into that, you know, and introduce a lot more elements. And as you say, Silent Hill Homecoming was the prime example of that, where I think that's the game where you can combat roll, which to think back to something like Silent Hill 2, as I was saying, with its like clunky controls and like, you know, James Sunderland's like swinging like madly swinging around like a 2x4 with no clue what he's doing. To then think that like a few games later, your main protagonist would be combat rolling around with like a veritable arsenal. Like, it's just anathema to what that series was. They wanted to go with the trends and wanted it to sell.
Was Homecoming the one that they had the psychological profile, or was that another one?
I can't remember. I'm going to be honest, I can't remember. It might have been, but yeah, I can't say for that.
Because I remember, and I have to admit, Until Dawn did this as well, probably better, but they did a thing where they basically ask the player a couple of questions and they say, what are you afraid of? Wink wink. Are you afraid of this? Are you afraid of that? And then they tailor the experience based on that. You know, like, oh, you're afraid of clowns, and then in the next chapter a clown's going to pop up. Are you afraid of spiders? I mean, who isn't? And, you know, spiders are going to pop up. That kind of thing. And I think that is really good. But would you say, and again, I'm sorry, I'm hitting you with the hard questions today. Would you say that there is like a danger of these kind of games being too ambitious?
I think that's a really good point, and I think you're completely right in that way of... Do you mean in the sense of like having like big locations and like high-end like graphics and like different gameplay styles and stuff? Is that the kind of way that you mean? Like,
yeah, I suppose like if it's a successful horror game, it would build on the success of, you know, its predecessor, but at the same time it says, right, we're not just going to have the same game as last time, we're going to put in, you know, mechanic X, mechanic Y, you know, put a little bit of Z, we'll sprinkle that on, we'll, you know, make it bigger, better, bombastic, we'll make it basically a former shell of itself. Because I have to admit, like, going back to Resident Evil, if you compare Resident Evil 1 to Resident Evil 6, like, the two seem like completely different games. And it's like the same as well with, this is a favourite example of yours, with Dead Space 1 compared to Dead Space 3.
I was just thinking that.
Yeah. Because this is the thing, like, you know, you made a great point there about how external factors can ruin what makes a good horror game, especially games like Dead Space, as we were saying there, Dead Space 1 versus 3. Dead Space 1 is this very claustrophobic, dark, gritty game where you're fighting through this abandoned spaceship, versus 3, which, to the best of my knowledge, is just like, it's just a shooter.
It basically is. Like, it is that third person, like, almost cover shoot. Yeah, it is almost cover shooting from what I recall. In that sense, I completely agree that like ambition, you know, the ambition of wanting to be like a kind of like a really successful, like, you know, top of the sales chart title can like completely destroy what makes a great horror experience, because you're trying to cater to a much broader audience. Not everybody's into horror, so there's like, let's downplay these elements. And Resident Evil and Dead Space are the absolute prime examples. Silent Hill as well, I think, to an extent as well. But those three are the absolute prime examples of that, say selling out, but it is almost like selling out, in that sense. I think as well, in terms of ambition, there can sometimes be a danger of a sequel to a horror game, like almost trying to like one up itself, and one up its predecessor. I think of Outlast in that regard. Now, I've played Outlast, and I played its DLC, but I never played Outlast 2. But from what I've seen and what I've heard, Outlast 2 just was like, it seemed that the main design, like the key point when they were designing the game was like, right, how can we top everything that we did in Outlast 1? Like, and, I'm sure a lot of games think that, but it was just like, how can we top the gore? Like, how can we like top the shock value and stuff? So, very famous example is like one of the first enemies that you meet in the game. Like, if the enemy catches you, like throw you to the ground, and like, sorry, it's a bit explicit imagery coming up here, but they have a giant axe which they'll slam into your character's groin and then proceed to rip out. And you're kind of like, well, I feel like I've seen everything in this game now. As shocked as you might be in the first instance, like, where's there to go from there? That was like 0 to 100 in like a second. There's no pacing, there's no build up to anything like that, no build up or anything at all. So I think there can be a danger of that as well, of like just trying to be like, how can we just one up ourselves to the extreme and like ruining your game in that sense?
I have to admit, I totally agree with you there, because I've seen the playthroughs as well, and I mean, I've seen like a lot of streamers play it as well, and it's just, although Outlast 1 is gory, it almost, and I can't believe I'm justifying this, but it almost feels as if there's a purpose for most of it. Not all of it. Like, there's some bits you're just like, why is this in the game to begin with? Like mutilation and everything. But it's like a basic premise, it's a reporter goes into a haunted, or no, I keep saying haunted. There's no ghost. Well, there is one ghost, but...
Spoilers!
Yeah. I mean, there's one Casper lurking around, but I jest. He's not friendly. He is a ghost, but he's not friendly. He goes into this asylum just with the sole purpose of trying to figure out what's going on, and it's a simple plot. For Outlast 2, they do a similar thing where it's like a husband and wife duo. So how to put this nicely? Their helicopter crashes and they end up in this like very fundamentally religious town. It doesn't hit the same chords, I would say. Like, from what I've seen of it, it just seems gorier, it seems, just more disgusting. And this is the thing, because I think Dead Space 2 did a similar thing for its marketing, where they did a thing where it was like, they got people's mums in. I don't know if you've ever seen this advert, but they got people's mums in to like watch clips of Dead Space 2, and the tagline was something like, oh, Dead Space 2 is so gory that your mum won't approve of it. Like a very weird advert. Like, why would your mum be watching you playing Dead Space? But anyway, I digress. But that's the thing though, is as you said, it's trying to build up on what came before it. And, you've obviously, if you've got like a hit game, you've got to usurp the previous one. You've got to say what's going to happen in this game that's going to, shock the people even further. And if that means more gore, then, or, more action or more set pieces that kind of show like a more bombastic side of it compared to just having like a silent, slow experience, then that's just going to detract from what makes a horror game good.
That's the nail on the head there. Like, completely.
So, just as a final, talking point to wrap up for the night before we go trick-or-treating. Actually, I tell a lie. There's still time. There's still time.
Before we lock ourselves in and get away from the trick-or-treaters.
I know. Who am I kidding? I'm acting as if we're like 12 years old all over again. It's like, no, we're on the other side of the door where we turn off the lights and then eat all the candy, Yeah, as a closing point, what are your final thoughts on this topic?
So I would reiterate that for me, the three, if you want to make a good horror game, focus on sound, atmosphere, and pacing. And I think as well, I would also posit, like, for any game developers or future game developers listening to this, I'd posit two questions to consider if you're making a horror game. Number one is, think about how you're going to sustain the horror, because we've kind of discussed this before, but a lot of games that maybe start off as horror games lose that You know, through for whatever reason, things like Alien Isolation or some of the Resident Evil games, Five Nights at Freddy's, it's a very difficult thing to keep and sustain that horror for a whole gaming experience. So that's a key point I would think about. And number two, I'd also say, well, how are you going to compel your player to keep playing? Because let's face it, if a game is far too scary, then like, you know, you're going to turn it off, aren't you? You know, at the end of the day, like you're going to be like, oh, well, what's the reason for me to carry on? But if you can create a compelling narrative or like a satisfying gameplay loop or whatever it is, something to keep like a good pacing, you know, it doesn't feel too overwhelming. You can get your player to keep progressing through and to experience the whole game. So think about those two questions as well, because I think they're very key as well to making a good horror game.
I feel as if the central question, really, that we're coming away with today is why? Why should this horror game exist? Like, especially, as you said, if anybody's listening to this and trying to write down tips furiously, please pause and think about us. But yeah, you've got to ask yourself why this game's created. Like, what is the main objective of it? Because, I mean, I can sit here as like an armchair gamer, you know, and be like, I want a horror game with, you know, deep plots and, you know, spookums and jump scares, but I also want robots and guns. You get a lot of people like that who want, like, contradicting things.
Yeah.
Which is why we've got Dead Space 3, but that's beside the point. Therein lies the issue. It's like, why are you making this game? Are you making it to spook people? Are you making it to provide like a richer narrative for your world? Like, for example, Slender, which I have to admit, while the arrival, I wouldn't say it's great, but at the same time, it's not the worst. I appreciate it for like them trying something different, if you know what I mean. It's all fair and good for people to be like, oh, it's a terrible game and things, but the fact they tried a story like says a lot about it, and I admire them for it, at least taking a stab at it, because there's nothing worse than a game being lazy, especially with its horror, and just saying, oh look, a jump scare, there we go. I mean, one of the worst jump scares I ever had, fun fact, you know, Satsunami exclusive here, was when I played the original, not the original, but Call of Duty 3. Did you ever play that when it came out?
Yeah, no, I played that on release.
Do you remember the very first mission where you go into the abandoned house and one of the enemies pops out and like grabs your gun and you're supposed to mash like circle or B or whatever console you're playing on? That made me jump out my skin, could I just say, because I was just expecting, oh, you're going to shoot people and that's it. And it used to terrify me every time because I never knew when they were just going to, you know, jump out and get you. And, you know, again, that's not a horror game. That's, well, horrors of war. I don't want to undersell the war too bad.
Philosophical kind of horror.
Yeah. I mean, at least it's better than the horror that came after it. That, of course, being the Zombies franchise, which is, we're not unpacking that mess. You know, like, even though that is like a spin-off of it, yeah, that's another example, as you said, of like giving too much power to the players and, you know, you can gun them down and it just becomes a power fantasy. So to kind of like summarize my long-winded ramble there, yeah, like, why is the horror game being created? You know, that's the central point here. And then after that, yeah, you just got to make sure you build up the atmosphere, the sound design, basically everything you touched on, Adam. I'm just stealing your notes now at this rate.
Hey, it's back.
Never. But you did. You made like a lot of great points there. Like, would you say that it is like a interdependent relationship between the players and the developers, that the players have to kind of give feedback and kind of let the developers know what's working, what isn't working? This is like in a perfect world I'm thinking of, because I know at the end of the day, like, not everyone likes horror games, and if it was up to the player base, they would probably want like a shooter horror like hybrid. Yeah, in a perfect world we would get the perfect like horror experience with VR and robots and all of that good stuff. On that final spooky note, thank you so much, Adam, for joining me once again in this episode.
You are most welcome. I'll be off to go change my trousers now. Another pair soiled for the year.
But that's why you wear brown trousers. I mean,
true. Why I only own brown trousers.
I know, you got to speedrun this spookum. This spookum atmosphere. What is it they say in speedruns? It's like soiled percent or something like that. Speedrun. We're going to get that horror groove going on. But as we go away and we search the bowels of Netflix for the next spooky horror, once again, everybody, thank you all so much for joining us on this, this discussion on probably what you're going to be playing next this month. And as always, stay safe, stay awesome, stay hydrated, and please don't eat too much trick-or-treating sweets because I'm probably going to hear it a mile away. Do you know what you can do? Just mail it to us. Just write Satsunami in an envelope and then post it. Trust me, we'll know. We'll know it's coming to us. Don't you worry.
Don't eat too many trick-or-treaters either. That's bad for your digestion.
I mean, that's true. From personal experience, I would say that's true. That's why I turn off the likes these days, you know. Terrible business, yeah. Not as many kids on my lawn, but yeah. Anyway, on that depressing note, stay safe, stay awesome. And most importantly, do not get spooked. Bye, guys.
Bye-bye.